Welcome to the program Parthenon, Building Enduring Success. This is a presentation based on a book that I wrote in 2016. So it's an old presentation. It's about 10 years old. However, I think the content is still incredibly relevant to today. And so that's why I didn't update it too much, but rather presented it in its form that I had used at conferences and such back in the day. And we've all heard of the Parthenon. It's the Temple of Athena in Athens, Greece. Actually, I was just there a few years ago. It's amazing if you haven't been there. And it was built 2,500 years ago, and it's just this enduring symbol of ancient Greece. And so I thought it was a really good metaphor to use, because like in ancient Greece, programs need to endure long and difficult journeys filled with many battles, challenges, and changes, right? The program sizes that we work on are increasing in size and complexity, cost. There's always evolving scope. There's resource challenges. There's unplanned risks. There's stakeholder battles and budget constraints and unexpected problems. And so we need to make sure that our programs are going to endure like the Parthenon. And while the statistics here are 10 years old, I think if we reran them today, you'd find it tells the same story, which is that programs are increasing in size, but as the programs get larger, the larger ones are actually the ones that are least successful. And as you see here, large and grand projects were only 8% successful. And you could see the smaller ones were much higher. And so again, I'm confident if we reran this, you'd see the same results. And and there are a lot of reasons for that, and we know what they are, since those of us who work in the field. But in order for programs to endure, I believe that you need sort of 4 or 5 key components to that, which is sort of the Parthenon that I drew over here. So the bottom, the foundation, is the structure of the team, setting them up to maximize their effectiveness. And whenever I run a program, it's the first thing I focus on is what is the right structure. Then you implement the processes and tools, right? So that's your program management office. It's definitely the people in the middle that support everything. And there's the right amount of planning, right? So those are the 3 P's are the pillars, and then management, the program management sits over the top and makes sure that the work gets done. So when I talk about the Parthenon, this is what I'm talking about, and we'll dive into this over the course of the presentation. And so I mentioned structure is the bottom of it. It's the foundation. It ensures that the program is set up properly to maximize the effectiveness and optimize. Organizing the work into discrete and logical buckets. This is so important, is making sure that you're setting up the program properly with the right structure, the right work streams, because that drives clear roles and responsibilities. It ensures sort of matrixed accountability. So all the programs that we're on right now are so complex that nobody really reports to people directly. They're matrixed and they require influence. And so I also believe that you have to manage sort of solutions end to end. So it's the structure that drives and holds up the entire Parthenon. And again, when I'm on programs, I spend the most amount of time trying to figure out what is the right logical structure. And I mentioned solutions. And so with Agile, the whole solution train and release train concept, I'm a big fan of, because work is so complicated that you need these teams that manage across the delivery teams. And you can see sort of in the picture I have on the right. And so a solution team might be a project, by the way, or a solution train in an Agile construct. But it really is organizing your work around the particular solution, whether it's a system or a process enhancement or something like that. You really want that sort of end-to-end accountability on a team. And I think there's many benefits, and I won't drain it, but I mentioned that having the scope in one place drives accountability. So now you have one team that's accountable for sort of end to end, and not doing that, there's lack of understanding boundaries and turf wars and things like that. You can drive a plan end to end so that you know what you're working on, and you can sort of track and manage the piece end to end. You can manage the scope holistically, the full solution from maybe it's a technology solution, managing that design end to end, because in today's environment, I'm confident in almost every case. The scope and the design and the testing that we have of our solutions spans across multiple teams. I also mentioned every program that we're on these days seems to be matrixed, where you have various organizations and various teams accountable for it. So setting up in this structure allows, and you can see I have the roles in sort of different colors, and it sort of allows that focus, but then you can see it spans across. And I'm a big fan of having sort of what I call the horizontal leaders. So in this case, it's the business lead and the delivery lead and the testing lead are accountable for their domains, right? The people with their matching colors. And then you have the vertical accountability, which are the projects and the solutions. And then therefore this sort of matrix model drives accountability of both delivery, which is vertical, as well as the domain expertise, which is horizontal. Roles and responsibilities are important, obviously, for each level of the program. Whether it's the delivery team focusing on specific assets, the solution end-to-end, the project, the program, and just some examples of roles and deliverables. This is sort of basic program management stuff, but the roles and responsibilities align directly to the structure. So then you've got, so that was the foundation, the structure. Now you've got the program management office, the PMO, which is the processes and tools, right? So it's the first pillar. And similarly, I have some old data in here, but I'm confident that the data is still relevant, which PMI did a study where they tested organizational maturity and project maturity. And no surprise, those organizations and projects that have standard practices and processes, in this case, are almost twice as more successful, or 50% to 100% more successful by having those practices. So no surprise there, because practices come with rigor. It's just some empirical data that demonstrates the case. And so the PMOs, right, build processes and tools that align to the structure. So that's really important. Once you set up the structure, all of your reporting and all of your tracking should be organized in the same way, which allows us to diligently manage the work and then provide transparency into the delivery against that, which includes any kind of risks and so on. It defines the what, right, and the how. What are we going to do? How do we do it? What are the processes, and so on. I did add a new bullet in here around AI, because AI is going to be, if it's not already, infused in all of the things that we do, especially around processes. So deliberately thinking about how to optimize the effectiveness or the efficiencies of your processes using a tool like AI is incredibly important and relevant, and then that allows us to focus on more impactful things. I also believe that there's really kind of 4 buckets of things within a PMO. And so the first is how we work. So these are playbooks, right? Playbooks, whether it's how we run our PMO, whether it's a delivery playbook like a software delivery lifecycle, process documentation. It's important to document these to help set expectations and to document the approach to take. Then single sources of truth. Projects and programs have so much information in them that it's imperative to have that information in a single source. What is the authoritative source of scope, the authoritative source of financials, of resources, and so on? Having that in one place and keeping it maintained, which is the second piece. So one is you have to have it in one place, and the second is you have to maintain the content so that it doesn't get out of sync or get stale. Then the third is about transparency, showing real-time health of your program, financial schedules, any kind of KPIs, things like that. That gets to sort of demonstrating how you're doing against your goals. And then there's all the operational things required to just run your PMO, status and risks, and where do you store your documents, and all sorts of the requests that come up. So in my opinion, these are sort of the 4 big buckets of work that sort of a standard PMO is accountable for. And I'm not going to drain this so much as point out that, and this was a very fun slide to create, by the way. This was before the days of AI, so I did this all manually, was demonstrating that all of the elements within a program office are all interrelated. And so they're not discrete deliverables so much as interrelated deliverables. So, the project plans roll up to the program plan, and the program plan influences the roadmap. And then there's effort that teams work on to do the work, and it's the resources that do the effort, but the resources cost money, so they're in the financial model. And so you sort of get the point of all of these have to be managed as an interrelated set of deliverables and not discrete ones. And there's a lot of systems out there that'll do that for PMs, but I think it's recognizing that these interdependencies exist So we've talked about structure, we've talked about PMO. The middle, the center holding up everything is the people. The structure will not work without the people. It will crumble. And there's some studies that say we spend 80% of our time with our work colleagues. And so it's important that we recognize that and build those relationships. There's lots of different roles that all have to work together on programs. And there's studies that say that talent deficiencies hamper almost half of strategy implementation efforts. And I believe that. I really do believe it's people that get the work done. And by the way, even in the environment of AI, I still believe that it's the people that are going to make projects successful. And it's important to have a strong team with high-performing team members. To that end, I think there's certain competencies that are needed for each of the roles, and I think about competencies in 4 ways. And by the way, I have a separate presentation that goes specifically into what I believe are the core competencies, especially for project managers. But I think there's sort of role fundamental competencies, so that's their role-specific work. So a BA needs to know about requirements, or a tester needs to know about testing methods. Then there's more of the consultative skills, which are the softer skills to interact with people, whether it's facilitation or influencing or so on. Then there's understanding the business acumen. What is the business? What is the industry for the projects that we work on? And then for technical programs, it's important to understand the technical acumen. And I actually think these 4 buckets can be applied to every role within a project. Those people require motivation. And it's important to understand what those motivators are. And everybody's motivated by different people. Some people's, they have different currency. Some people it's recognition. Some people it's working on cool technology. And it's important to understand what those are and then empower the people to be successful. A we culture versus a they culture, right? So trying not to have blame and recognizing that everybody's sort of, especially on a project, working towards the same goal. And you want to recognize this, you want to be a champion for people and deliberately think about how to engage the team members, because doing that, there's lots of studies that show result in better outcomes, better quality, better productivity, you're not losing people, and so on. So recognizing that we need to motivate our team members is critical. A couple other considerations on managing people. Because work has become so complex, I think in some cases it makes sense to have a dedicated resource for critical roles. And I know we can't always get full-time resources, especially in scarce skills, but there is definitely a correlation between focus and ability to be successful. Recognizing that now, and I wrote this well before COVID, but the whole virtual model has exploded since then. I'm a big believer in fit, in that maybe people aren't necessarily want to do a bad job so much as maybe it's not the best fit for them. And as leaders, we have to figure out how to have our resources fit the roles the best, which also includes using contractors. And if there's not the right fit, when there's deficiencies, we have to look to supplement that. And then my favorite kind of resources on teams are ones that I call multipliers, right? So those are people that have a multiplication impact on the teams and the programs, because they just make the people around them better. And everybody wants those people on their teams. So the last column is really around planning. So you've got the structure, we've got the people and tools in place, and now we got to make sure that we plan everything so that it comes together. And this is sort of a generic SDLC where the scope of the work drives. Based on the scope, you figure out what are the resources and effort, and based on those 2 things inform the schedule and the cost, and so sort of a high-level planning framework. And there's lots of things that we need to plan. We need to plan for the scope and what is the work that we're working on, the effort, right? How much time does it take to do the work? What resources are working on that? The cost of those things. The schedule, left to right, is always my favorite, as opposed to just being given a date. And I know we don't always have control over that. And then obviously communications. And so, not just jumping into the project, but deliberately planning all of these things with documented assumptions is kind of critical. And that's why I say it's an investment up front. A lot of times our stakeholders want us to just jump in and just start doing stuff. And it's critical to do the planning up front, even in an agile environment, I would argue, is baselining the work and figuring out the clear accountabilities. There's going to be challenges. So accounting for rework and utilizing schedule contingency, adding in a little bit of buffer, if you will, is important. So we've talked about the base, we've talked about the pillars, and now it comes down to sort of management that sits over the top. And each of the components that we've talked about is really allows for the effective management of the program. So the structure provides the organization from which to manage, the plans drive the expectations, the processes and tools, I talked about transparency, give the insight, and it's the people that actually do the work. And the way I think about management is in 3 categories. It's tracking and transparency, it's taking action when needed, and it's communicating. And so for tracking and transparency, those PMO processes are the ones that are going to provide those things. And so, for example, you track the scope, and that gives you transparency into the amount of work that's coming through or the amount of changes. You're tracking the schedule, that gives you the insights into how we're doing against commitments and milestones. Similarly with cost, that tells us how we're doing against financial commitments, resources and quality, and there's probably 20 other things you can track, but you get the point that these processes are what allow us to report against these. So bucket number 2 then is taking action. And there's constantly challenges that require escalation and require management approval, whether it's additional scope that comes in, whether it's delays in schedule and figuring out, can we make up the time? Do we need to add people? Do we need to extend the dates? Do we need to remove barriers so people can continue? There's financial overruns and figuring out, are we just have more expensive resources, or do we ask for more money? Since projects are mostly made up of people, there's always resource challenges that need to get focused on, risks and issues that pop up constantly, and then ultimately coming down to decisions. So there's lots of kinds of actions that management needs to take. And then there's communications and reporting. And PMI says we spend 80% of our time communicating, and there's lots of different ways we do that, whether that's status reports, whether it's meetings, stakeholder meetings, maybe newsletters or town halls, program calendars. So lots of examples of the kinds of communications that we have on programs. So some other considerations for management. Accountability of roles is so important, and clarity of who's accountable for what, so that there's no overlapping accountabilities and there's no gaps in accountabilities. Those processes and tools allow us to maintain the program information, constantly looking on how do we improve, The program will evolve, the structure evolves, the processes evolve, and we need to be flexible to do that. Focusing on sort of how the work gets done. Leadership is absolutely critical. And then as we're communicating, I talked about all the different kinds of communications. It's really important to understand your audience. So for senior executives, the communication should not be incredibly detailed. They should be focused on the punchline and where you want help, as opposed to just draining information. And so, I talked about the different elements. I think every one of them is critical for the program. And so here's examples of what happens if one of them doesn't exist. So without structure, there's confusion in roles, maybe there's gaps in overlap, there's just ineffective delivery because there's not clarity of what the work is, or things aren't organized well, and work probably falls between the cracks. Not having your PMO means not having the processes in place, or the lack of transparency. You don't know what people are doing, and the PMO is sort of the glue that connects the dots in the middle, and so you don't have that. Without the people, the whole thing crumbles, and that maybe that's having the wrong skills or the wrong people or low morale, and all those things result in poor quality and not delivering against commitments. Similarly, without planning and just jumping right in, the probability of success is really low because teams won't be aligned, maybe dates or forecasts weren't accurate or thought through, and then just the ability to meet commitments is pretty low. And then without management, things come to a stall because there's not communication, the barriers aren't being removed or escalations, and so the work just comes to a halt. So every one of these is needed for your Parthenon to be successful and to maintain. And so, look, in order for our programs to survive, just like the Temple of Athena, we need all the elements. The foundation as the structure, the program office to provide the tools, high-performing people to hold up the whole structure, proper planning, and then diligent management over work. So hopefully this helped you sort of think through the ways of our program, maybe in a little different method. It's one of the several books that I had written. It's the one there in that sort of reddish color about establishing enduring IT programs, but I've got other ones around skills and delivery and assessing. So interested in your thoughts. As I mentioned, this presentation is 10 years old, but I think it's still relevant. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the metaphor and if I missed anything. But thanks for watching.